Okay, so in the subreddit Learn Programming, there are sometimes questions regarding like what's the difference between a backend, a front end, what does full stack mean, and all those kind of things. And I noticed that with today's technologies and how we progress when we learn something, some things have become easier and some things have become more confusing. So let's start with a very simple example. So I open up a new project here, and I directly have that in my localhost, and I will explain what that means in a second. So let's just create a simple HTML file here for now. All right. So let's just say we call that index. And we'll give it a title of test, and oops, maybe not like that, maybe test, and then we jump into and say h1, this is the body. Okay, now this is now a file that I can serve in multiple ways, but let's look at the most logical one when we have a deployment, right? So if I basically go over here, I can basically now see, okay, this is test. And as you can see, this is served from localhost IDE. So since it's an HTML file and I'm on my machine, of course, what I could also do is to basically simply, that doesn't work in Ubuntu, hold on, open up the file system and basically say, okay, so where do we call this IDE? Index HTML. And basically say open with Chrome. Oops, actually I should have opened that with Firefox. Hold on a second. Okay. So now you can see, ooh, doesn't even want to do that. Chrome is, yeah, that's what I mean. Chrome doesn't have the permissions here. Need to do that here. Okay, so now you can see this is exactly the same I'm seeing here. So the difference is that we now basically, it's just HTML, so it might as well be directly opened in a browser. And as you can also see, I have a different kind of, this is not an HTTP, it's a file. Right here, I don't see it, but there's actually HTTP in front of it. So this basically means that if this is in the internet, then this wouldn't be localhost, but your domain. That needs to be served somehow. So how does this serving work? And in this case, it is a very static file. So what I have running here is simply in Apache, but that is really not important. This could be a Node server. This could be an Nginx. This could be, it really does not matter what kind of infrastructure you run that on. The important thing here is that if I visit this, then, so in this case, let's actually be more precise here. In this case, what Apache, so I'm running Apache, would do is to say, well, if this index HTML exists, serve it. If it does not exist, create an let's say this, and then you say we get this 404, and you can already see, yeah, this is done by Apache. This is by the server itself, right? This file does not exist, so the server basically has a particular response. That, by the way, we can of course influence and so on, but that's not what this tutorial is about. So that means that even if you just have a front end, and even with the confusing term serverless that now makes the rounds, it's always true that your files are served from somewhere. And the serverless simply means you are not the one taking care of that kind of infrastructure, but it is in existence, of course. So what does that mean? It basically means that okay, from our perspective now, this is a content that gets served through some form of server, and when we deploy it, then that is done accordingly. And even though it really doesn't matter if you have that in a Docker or whatever, at the end of the day, somebody serves those files, and in this case, it's a static file, so it's not a dynamic file. Now, if we had our whole front end here, so if like I were to get my I don't know what, my Vue.js in, or my React or whatever, and then build on top of that, and I might, and this is maybe something that confuses a lot of people, I might use my local server, my local node instance, in order to render particular things that are then in the end static. Okay. So whenever you see something that has like I mean, most of the times like a web or a public folder or whatever, and you then run your precompilers to run the less or the sass together in your CSS, and all that kind of stuff, that's normally something that happens on your local host, if you want so, right? And it's going to be within your, actually, let's make an example. Let's make an example and say we want to use a particular package. Let's just say we here create maybe a style sheet, and it's going to be a SCSS file. No, actually, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to make it more complex from the beginning. Let's delete this. Let's actually run a command. Neon3 new app IDE. Excuse me. Okay, so this will install basically the complete front end and back end for me. So if I look at this, I see a lot of different things, and just to see if this still works, let's get rid of the index. Okay. So this now is a Neon3 PHP backend, but that's not important here. What's important here is that the files that are served work very, very differently. So in the case of an Apache, I have an htaccess file. And as you can see, what this does is, and maybe this is a little bit of an overview here that's important, is, okay, so if we're now influencing the not found, right? So if the file or the folder does not exist, then redirect to a different script. And we don't have to understand this. This is just like something we can basically see here. So I have my demo, which is now exactly this, right? So this doesn't change here. But what you can see is that, okay, so there's a folder component demo, and then particular things are used. And this, for example, would be the view. So this is then rendered on completely rendered on the server. So there, as of now, we have no front end whatsoever. And how does this look like if I look into the, and this is probably something that you should always take into consideration. So if I go into the network folder and refresh this page, I will basically see that I receive this completely, right? So if you look at the response, you can see this is exactly what's happening. So this is already, all of this already happened on the server. There's nothing we do in the front end to generate this. This is, I mean, actually is there a way to look at this payload? Yep. Let's look at this. So here you can see it. So this is basically the HTML that we got delivered. See that? It's the complete page. So that means instead of serving a static file, I apparently serve something that is dynamic, right? Because this does not look the same for everyone. So getting back to this example, let's just say that in this demo now, actually let's just change the view. Let's make this even easier. creating your first endpoints. I'm going to change this to an S, right? Just to make this pretty simple. And wait, where did I change the S? Sorry. Creating your first endpoints. Okay, so here, okay. So here's where I expect the S now if I reload, right? And as you can see, that is what is happening. So this wasn't any kind of front-end technology now. This is like simply it renders differently now in the coming directly from the server. Now that does not mean that I can't have any kind of front-end logic that would go and work with this accordingly. So actually, let's create something like that. So I'm gonna have just a demo controller. Okay. So normally you would have to account for that file being somewhere placed in here, but this is just in Neon 3. This automatically happens in this instance. So I can basically just write, a front end now that happens on this particular route. So let's just say, for example, that we go over the, we're going to make this very, very simple. I'm basically simply going to say document query selector all, for each element, and then we're simply going to say something like really, I don't know, let's do something visual so we can see it, right? So we're going to say element style color is red, right? Make this very primitive. And you can now see that this turned red, right? And what you can also basically notice is, since this was there from the beginning, I don't have to have a document ready, because when this gets executed on the client side, so in the browser, this is already there in this case, right? So the idea to basically say, well, instead of having like JavaScript vanilla files that are rendered, I could of course have a complete a complete installation and maybe even have a single page application with React, Vue.js, Angular, you name it, and use the router completely on the front end, and I just deliver based on very particular things. But the main idea, the interesting takeaway here is, of course, that the output that you are seeing here is not necessarily something that exists as a static file on the backend, and that is especially handy. So now let's actually look at something a little bit more complex. So let's say I have something that I want to render on a particular condition, and JavaScript needs to know it. So for example, let's say here we also going to say, and this is very simple actually, we're going to say alert you run this app from base. Okay, so as you can see, what it tells me now is I run this app from localhost IDE. So how does this work, right? This is basically the magic of an hybrid solution, like you see in many other concepts as well. I mean, like Laravel would be one of those examples. So this is not a static file, which basically means at the time of rendering, I can make particular substitutions on the back end before it's delivered to the client. So what we've just seen here is static from the perspective of the front end, but it's dynamic from the perspective of the back end. What do I mean by this? If I look into the source code now and search for you run this, where is it? Where are you? Where are you? Yeah, here we go. Caching is a thing. Here you can see it all the way at the bottom. Let me actually try to, if I can get this a little bit bigger here. Yeah. Here, you run this app from localhost IDE. This is how the browser looks at it. See, it is static. It does not say base. There's no front end that would basically, you know, grab that and make any kind of logic with it. This is how the browser receives it. And that's basically what you can do if you have backend side rendering. And you will see that you know, produced a lot in any kind of I mean, your this doesn't have to be PHP. This is your Express app in Node that takes, you know, like handlebars or pug templates and puts it together, and basically if you have a particular route, then the output is served accordingly. Maybe you know, a cache is used, you know, all the kind of things that I don't want to get into right now. But the point is that this is simply something that enables you to do a lot of things, and that is why that hybrid approach makes so much sense. Because you can have something that is completely, let's now do something else maybe so you understand what I'm saying. I can basically go into all kinds of different things. So if I were to create an API endpoint, let's say in components, right? So in that case, I'm going to say Neon 3, new component, and then I take something like, I don't really know. I'm going to call it test. And I'm going to say this is an API endpoint. And so what I have here now probably has a get test. Yes. Okay. Okay. Right. And here I basically say return. And I'm simply going to call this answer. And the answer is going to be, you did it. Okay, it's going to be very primitive. Now, there's a particular thing about Neon 3, but it really doesn't matter. This could be any kind of backend, any whatever. But now this basically runs in a particular context, right? For us, that context is within an API. So if I basically duplicate this tab and say, okay. Oops, yeah, we don't need that, I guess. So instead of this, I'm going to say api.v1/test. Then okay, so in that case, I can't. I actually need to have a request because this is something I require here. Test, and then I simply say key is value. Then I get the answer you did it as a JSON object. So now I basically created an API endpoint. Okay, so now let's basically get to that and say, okay, so I can basically ask this backend now, and let's do that with the fetch command. Fetch, and then basically I say, okay, base. We already know that that's going to translate to, you know, the actual to this part basically, and right, is that what's happening? Sorry. And basically I then say, okay, base, and then you need the api.v1, and then I say test. Okay, and let's make this hard for now and say, okay, key is value, or you know what, let's actually get rid of the requirement here. We don't need that. Oops. We don't need that at all. The only thing we really need is this to understand what's happening. Then result. So we should normally now transform this. Actually, let's do this. Result JSON. Then format it. Okay, is that not how it works? Promise returns from JSON. Is it? Interface Bobby. Oh, okay. Actually, you know what? I'm sorry for this little detour. But actually quickly have to see how that's done because I haven't used vanilla in the longest time. Response.json. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, why? We need to return. Okay. And then we simply say, okay, let's log this. Let's log this. And so what we expect to happen now, and you know what, let's even go a step further. So in what we're doing here, how does this look again? Let's create a button up there. Let's create a button up there and say button on click request test API. Okay, and I really need to get rid of this alert. That bothers me. And here we're basically going to say function, did we call it request? Yep, function request. Okay, make this super primitive. Now, again, here we have our dynamically rendered endpoint, and this would be a pure backend API, right? There's nothing rendered. All of what we're doing now happens basically in the front end. So here, this front end now has basically exactly this. Instead of where it says base here, will now basically give me the right kind of URL. Let's actually, whoops, let's quickly look at that to verify that that's true. I don't know why this caches so hard. Here we can see it, right? So here, localhost IDE API v1 test. So exactly what we had here, right? So what we should get now is this answer you did it, and it should be logged in our console as soon as we press this button. Let's try it out. There you go. And this is basically now what my front-end application would do. Now, again, in more complex scenarios, this would be your Angular application or whatever. But the point is that I now created a very hybrid structure. So on one hand, this component demo that we're looking at here renders something for the front end. And on the other hand, this is a pure backend application, right? But that enables me now to basically take a lot of shortcuts depending on what I need. So what's for example the big problems that we sometimes have? Well, sometimes we want to render something and it needs to be dynamic, but on the other hand, it needs to feel static to, for example, crawlers. If you have something like a shop, you need the Google bots to basically find all of your products, even though, of course, you don't have an HTML for every product. That's just generated, right? So it needs to feel like this would be a hard-coded page. And that's basically how all of those hybrid frameworks think about it, to say like, yes, okay, so you do have a front end, you do need an API that front end communicates with, but there's no reason why this front end cannot be delivered by the backend itself in order to enable particular things and basically provide you with a lot of advantages. And this is actually the most primitive example, right? To say like, okay, so what is here? I'm saving myself to store the URL somehow. I can pass all kinds of variables there, and basically even give you the complete JS could be based on certain conditionals you have on permissions and all kinds of things. So that is basically to go full circle. What is the difference between a pure front end, a pure back end? So here we basically have everything, right? So let's just say, so just as a comparison, that there is something like I can in theory go and look at this, right? So this should basically, if it exists, it's served, right? That's what we told the system. So that basically means if instead of that I'm saying, okay, so there's component, there's demo, and then there is demo.view.html. Probably I need to get rid of the S. There we go. Character encoding was not declared. Okay, so there's a lot of problems here with this because it's just a partial. But this is an existing file. I mean, of course, nothing will work here now, right? Request is not defined. I mean, not even the JS did exist. And you can see this is now basically just a template on how this is intended to look like. No CSS, nothing. But the principle is, okay, this is a static file. So in a static file, I would have now the requirement to say like, okay, so I need to include my CSS and I need to include my whatever. I need to iterate over this front end side, right? As you can see, this is basically what we're doing here. And so this is a backend side template engine, just like you would use a node when you use your I don't know what, handlebars or your pug or all kinds of things. So the output of that would be of course static. Once that's done, it's served to the front end, and that is why it is very confusing nowadays. If you learn only JavaScript, there's a huge advantage of saying like, hey, there's only one language you need, but it's very blurry on, well, what is the back end, what is the front end, what are the where's the cutoff line of dynamic and static rendering, what happens really on the front end, what happens really on the back end. And that is basically a little bit of a challenge of our days, and I hope this gave you a little bit of insight and explains maybe how to at least feel at home in that kind of realm. And that's all there is to it, basically. So even if you have a complete external, so of course I can call this now from any kind of this one, right? This is not this is a public endpoint at this. I mean, I have no restrictions here in this particular API here. So you would basically have many possibilities to trigger this and ask for this externally. You could basically use this as a pure backend and say like, no, I'm not rendering anything. I have, I don't know, an Android app that is talking to these API points, and the only thing I'm doing here is talking to the API points. That's a possibility. But it really depends on what you want to do. And a lot of the, October CMS, for example, is based on Laravel, that basically uses that. A lot of actually everything that would be search engine optimization conscious, right? Whether it's be a WordPress blog or a shop or whatever. uses this kind of hybrid approach in order to basically facilitate what they need and give you the possibility to develop in both worlds simultaneously. So that's basically it. If this is something that you're interested in, dabbling into a little bit, you will find in the in the info box below the video a couple of links that might be of additional help. I also do tutoring to basically pick you up, because this now is very high level, and it's really it's really difficult to speak for whatever tech you're using in a broader sense. Maybe this is easier if we look at your particular project and the particular technology that you're using in order to get to the bottom of it. So feel free to request a one-on-one with me, and that maybe will help you to progress. Because if you understand that from a high-level perspective, it's just way easier to adapt in whatever technology you're using. And you will make better decisions on what to do on the back end, what to do on the front end. And that's basically what you want to know how it works. And that's the difficult thing if you go on Reddit or whatever, that you normally only get answers out of the perspective of the person that answers, and whatever is normal or the regular workflow from that person was basically going to be reflective in the answer, and not necessarily what makes sense for your particular stack. Okay, so that said, thank you so much for watching, and see you guys soon.